Hi, we're back. I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs, and this week we're going to talk about the Vital Signs report, our regular checkup on the well-being of Hamilton, something that the Hamilton Community Foundation does in partnership with the Hamilton Spectator. Shout out to the team at the Spec who did such an extraordinary job on the presentation of the report. In particular, Cheryl Steppen, Steve Bust, Graham Rockingham, Natalie Padden, and Paul Burton, who we really appreciate because they go well over and above the call of duty. My guest to talk about the Vital Signs report this week, this month, this year, are Dr. Karen Bird, the head of the Political Science Department at McMaster University, and Jeff Wingard, our all-purpose research guy and lead on the actual report. Thank you both for being here. We're really proud of this report, and the whole impetus is how do you engage citizens from across the spectrum in what's going on in Hamilton, how they can make a difference, how can evidence inform both public policy debates and a sense of what our priorities are in this community. So I'm going to put you on the spot because you were the guy in the trenches working with our expert panel in looking at the methodology. Tell us a little bit about the construction of the Vital Signs report and then highlight a few of the findings from 2018.
Sure thing. So one of the things we do with this report is try and get a sense. It covers a lot of ground. So we look at a wide range of subjects, and to do that effectively, we need the help of some expert advisors. And we pulled together an advisory panel of researchers from the city and McMaster and the community at large to help us figure out what are the measures that we should look at that will really gauge our progress. So in the environment, for example, which particular pollutants should we be looking at, which particular stats should we be pulling out, and really taking a closer look at to gauge the progress. So we did that for 10 issue areas, so we all the way from safety to low income to the environment to arts and culture, and then we tried to piece together some of the themes across what we found. So one of the, there was a lot of progress that we found in some of these areas that was, I think some of it was expected, some of it was not. High school education graduation rates going up, post-secondary education going up, air pollution declining, that's good. Crime rates falling. There was some surprising information around teen pregnancy rates that dropped by half over the last 10 years. So that was a surprising piece of good news, I think, that we found. A roaring economy in 2016 and 2017. And I think there had been some, we've seen that and felt that in Hamilton, that there's kind of this economic resurgence happening. It really was borne out by the information we collected. So, and it was across sectors. That was, I think, one of the other things. We were creating jobs in the industrial sector, in the retail sector, and in the manufacturing sector. So that's something new. There were also some pieces that weren't as positive. In the environment piece, we looked at how much waste are we diverting from landfill, and we'd been doing really well. We'd been diverting about 50% of our waste in 8 years ago. That's actually fallen to 42%. So that was perplexing, I think, and it's counterintuitive to kind of what we think, that we're always ramping up the recycling and composting programs, and we're not doing as good a job at that as we had thought, at least as I had thought. And then this question of disparities across Hamilton, so between neighborhoods and between groups that have persisted. So unemployment rates in some neighborhoods are below 2%. In other neighborhoods, they're above 16%. Poverty rates below 2% in some neighborhoods, above 40% in other neighborhoods. These continued disparities that we tracked, 10 years ago when we did our first Vital Signs and the Spectator's Code Red report persist. And I think those were some of the findings that we really pulled out and wanted to engage with the community about.
Excellent. Good summary. Karen, that's a great segue to some of your work. And you focused, and I'll allow you to expand on it, in diversity and leadership, in looking at intersectionality, and on this report specifically, you and a team of researchers with the YWCA did a report called the Accelerator Report, looking at diversity in leadership in Hamilton. And I want you to start by telling us a little bit about kind of the genesis of that report, its methodology, and then perhaps highlight some of the findings that you discovered in the course of your work.
Sure. So the Accelerator is an acronym for Executive and Community Leadership. It was inspired by a couple of things. Diversity Leads in Toronto, led at Ryerson University, has been doing these kinds of investigations of diversity in leadership in the big city, but we had nothing like that had been done in Hamilton. We had done at McMaster a report on women faculty back in, started in 2012 and reported in January 2014. So we thought with sort of the shortage or the lack of women faculty, and particularly at higher levels, we thought it would be useful to kind of broaden this investigation. And then we'd had a fruitful, McMaster and the YWCA had a fruitful relationship. So the idea was sort of generated to really kind of take this, as I say, diversity leads approach and methodology that's been well proven and that's been applied to many cities, apply to Hamilton and see what we found. So it's a fairly in-depth examination of the gender diversity and the racialized diversity in the leadership cadre or sort of sector across many different industry and employment sectors. We did it actually in 2014 for the first time, and then this is a second report in which we, on 2017, in which we add the racialized bit. We'd only looked at gender before. So we identify basically through organizational charts what are the leadership positions across 9 sectors: the legal sector, labor sector, education, health, and a number of others, and go through kind of a microscopic investigation of who's actually in those roles, looking at photographs and names, photographs being really important to identify racialized diversity, and assess what kind of benchmark really where we are at in terms of inclusiveness of women and of racialized diversity at the leadership level. We think leadership is really important. I mean, it may seem like a kind of an elite concern when we talk about issues of poverty and high school graduation rates and teenage pregnancy. This is a different kind of question, but we do think that leadership really matters for a number of reasons.
So connect those dots for us.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it's symbolic, and again, that sounds like that's kind of lightweight, but we say if we can't see it, we can't be it, and it sends, I think, a key signal to the community as to whose voices matter, who's around the decision-making table. It can be inspirational as well in terms of that, seeing women or minorities in important positions in the industry that you work in. Or in our leadership sector, for example. So it's symbolic, but it's also substantive, because these are the people who are making the decisions, whether it's about the allocation of how healthcare funding is going to be allocated in our local hospitals. It's the people around the leadership tables who are making that decision. And we know from broader research that the descriptive representation around the table actually does matter in terms of bringing diverse viewpoints to the table, making different kinds of decisions, and making decisions that better serve a wider sector of society. So that's sort of the connecting the dots of why leadership matters, why we look at these kind of this inclusion at this level.
And you wouldn't believe this, but we're approaching the midpoint and a break that we're going to have to take. But in a nutshell, highlight how Hamilton's performance in diversity of leadership stacked up against perhaps some of the other communities that you had surveyed.
Yeah, so in our report we'd actually do Hamilton and Halton, and so just on that comparison, Hamilton lags a bit behind Halton. both for inclusion of women and for inclusion of racialized diversity. Of course, the population basis is a little bit different as well, but we take that into account. So, and then for cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal that have been done, and those studies now go back to 2014. The numbers are very comparable. So for inclusion of women in these leadership positions, we're seeing in Hamilton and across those cities about 33 to 36%. Goes up a little bit each year in the cities that have been studied, and it did go up in Hamilton a couple of points from 2014 to 2017. For racialized diversity, it's astonishingly low in terms of inclusiveness in Hamilton. So 2017 Stats Canada has the visible minority population at 19% of Hamilton's population. And we found that 6% of leaders in our study in Hamilton are diverse minorities.
Pretty remarkable.
And it is lower than Toronto, but for again the figures are fairly comparable. So to kind of express that relative to what the population of diversity is in Toronto, say, which is like actually half of the population now are visible minorities. We're talking about a quarter of what we would call a parity index, where a group is represented in leadership positions similar to its share of the population.
So we've got some work to do.
Yeah, and much more work to do for diversity, for racial diversity than for women, but lots of work to do in both groups.
So on that rather disappointing note, we'll go to a break. We're going to come back and try and connect some of these dots further between, for instance, the racialization of poverty and why representation and leadership can have both an inspirational and aspirational effect on where we're heading as a community, and how we can make sure that everybody's part of the prosperity that is happening, although not nearly with a sense of equal distribution across this community. I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. We're talking about the Vital Signs Report with Dr. Karen Bird of McMaster University and Jeff Wingard, the all-purpose research guy from a whole bunch of places, including McMaster University and the Hamilton Community Foundation. We'll be right back after this break.
Cancer affects us all, and together we can make a difference. My name is Dr. Juergens, and I'm inviting you to a new fundraising event in support of the cancer program at Juravinski Hospital and Cancer Center. Embracing the fall spirit of giving thanks. It's an evening walk called Illuminite, a walk to shine a light on cancer. Join us on October 26th at the Earth to Table Farm in Flamborough. Register and start fundraising today.
You can never really be ready for the news that it's not an ear infection anymore, that it's cancer.
The Make-A-Wish Foundation gives hope, strength, and joy by granting magical wishes to children with life-threatening medical conditions.
Someone came in from Make-A-Wish Foundation and they told us we were going to get a wish. Annabelle can play soccer and she can do ballet. Everything seems so much bigger and better. Help us make a wish for a happy ending.
And we're back. I'm Terry Cooke. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs, and we're with Dr. Karen Bird of the Political Science Department at McMaster University and Jeff Wingard, researcher on the Vital Signs Report. And as we left at the break, Karen was talking about representation and leadership for both women and racial minorities and their respective underrepresentation. One of the troubling parts of the Vital Signs Report was, in fact, the deepening of segregation in neighborhoods relative to income disparities, and particularly the racialization of poverty. And I just want you to broaden that discussion a little bit for us and talk about how it is that maybe that isn't an accident of history, because it's one of my great passions, thinking about income inequality and diversity in our schools and our neighborhoods and access to affordable housing and all those kind of good things that people sometimes think is an accident of history. But when we look at, in fact, how our neighborhoods were created and our schools, the boundaries established, in fact, there was lots of active contemplation and policy making that affected where we're at. So,
Well, so just, so the racialization of poverty, when we look at Hamilton, we have a poverty rate of about 16% overall across the board, and that's an improvement. It was up at 22%, 15 years ago, has been falling since, which is great news. That's without some of the recent changes that have come into effect, like minimum wage increases and the Canada Child Tax Benefit. So we would assume that that trend kind of probably will continue for a reduction of poverty, which is great news. We're not there yet, but hoping to get there. But what that doesn't mean is that it's the same for everybody. As with many of these issues, when you drill down and look at different neighborhoods or different subpopulations, you see a very different picture emerge. So when we look at the poverty rate for Indigenous members of Hamilton, poverty rate is about 30%. When we look at lone mother families, again, poverty rate is twice what our average, what the general population. When we look at recent newcomers, so people that arrived within the last 5 years, the poverty rate is 3 times the general population. And some visible minority groups are about twice the rate. So members of the Black community, members of the Arab community, and some of those categories overlap. So members of the Arab community many are recent immigrants, so they're coming up to speed with language and job skills and that kind of thing. So it does take a little while to attach to the labor market. But it does speak to, I think, some of these systemic factors that are operating to marginalize some groups in our community more than others.
for sure. Karen, one of the areas of your focus and one of the great passions of mine is political participation in the democratic process. And at our event that we held, sold-out event at the Spectator a week ago, I said there is some irony for me in thinking about Hamilton being the place that elected the first African-Canadian member of Parliament and cabinet minister, the great Link Alexander, who was a mentor of mine, and Ellen Fairclough, the first woman in Canada's Parliament, who also was somebody that I got to know when I was a young, aspiring politician. And yet, when you look at participation, voting across sectors, and you look at political representation in this town, frankly, the way in which people participate in the democratic process, and certainly those who get elected, really doesn't come close to reflecting what this community looks like. So I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I can talk about 2 things. So one, I mean, what the report covers, of course, is just elected officials, and so those are actually pretty easy to count. You know, we sort of have a broad sense of the representativity of our elected members. But what we know in Hamilton, and this is really true generally, is that we actually do fairly well federally and provincially in terms of inclusiveness. We do much less well, this is true across Canada, municipally. It's largely because of the absence of parties. We may think of parties as gatekeepers, but what parties really do is they act to reach out and mobilize new voters, and they've done it in Canada very effectively at the federal level and provincial level. So we see these sort of subsector differences in inclusiveness, and there are reasons for them. They're also not accidents of history. They have to do with the kind of institutions that we have in place in our political system.
Can I just stop you there, because I am curious. In the larger cities, Montreal, Vancouver in particular, where there have been long-established municipal political parties, have they seen an uptick in better diversity in the cross-section of candidates that those parties are in?
They've done a little better, although not as much as you might think. And given that I said that parties have a lot to do with it, and I think that it is that there's still fairly weak party systems in those municipalities. They're not, those parties are not especially well funded. I mean, they're sort of organizations much more than they're parties, and they still suffer in those municipalities the same kinds of problems of low turnout. And low turnout is disproportionately low among marginalized minorities. So, and when you have kind of little money to work with, what candidates rationally do is they go to the people that they know are most likely to vote already. So we see at the municipal level, parties or no parties, just less initiative taken by parties or by candidates to reach out and mobilize those who are probably, not the most, they don't necessarily have the resources that are going to incline them to participate in politics.
Let's talk about voter turnout for a minute, because that too is, I think, troubling reality that we have substantially lower turnout in lower income neighborhoods, in more racially diverse neighborhoods, and as you say, candidates and incumbents inevitably spend their time and their resources in those places that are more likely to vote, and then it has a beyond the ballot box effect as well in terms of the sense that people have that they're either relevant or alienated from the process, that they matter, that they should be involved, and that there's a need and a place for everybody at the table.
Right.
Talk about that.
So in political science, we talk about a resource model of participation, which basically adds up to level of education, level of income, home ownership, and those are predictors of voter participation. So clearly poverty and being a newcomer as well, and there's a geographic story to this as well, a segregation that maybe if groups are economically segregated, racially segregated, they're just not so much on the radar, on the map of the candidates who are out there mobilized. So there's the sort of story of the resources that the individual citizen has, and I don't like to emphasize that too much because it kind of puts the blame on the individual. That they don't sort of have the wherewithal to get out and inform themselves and to vote. But the other half of it really is what the active agents in the political system are doing, the candidates and the parties.
For sure. I learned a bitter lesson in my first race as a 24-year-old boy candidate, where I spent a lot of time at McMaster University because I was a recent grad, assuming that the students would come out and support me en masse. Sure. And I neglected a single seniors building at the north end of Victoria Park. I remember it well. Lost the race by about 100 votes, and of course, when you looked at the cross-section, first of all, McMaster didn't turn out, which is not unusual because students come and go and they don't have that same sense of attachment. The seniors building turned out 90%, and about 80% of those voted for my opponent, and that put him over the top. I only made that mistake in one election, I can tell you for sure, and a year later in a general, I straightened that out, but there is a lesson there, and it isn't necessarily a lesson that inspires candidates to think more fully about the need to reach out. Right?
And I do want to emphasize that we do really well in Canada at the federal level and at the provincial level. There is a participation gap among newcomers, for example, but it's closed within 10 years. And so immigrants and visible minorities, now it depends on the minority group, and I'm glad that you specified that they're really, it's a mistake to kind of lump everybody together as a visible minority. But we see that gap close, and those people actually participating at higher levels 10 years on than Canadian-born non-minorities at the federal level and at the provincial level. But it's not happening at the municipal level for municipal politics.
I think in Hamilton, the last federal election we actually had the highest turnout since in the early 90s here. And yet the last municipal election we had here, we had several wards where turnout was below 30%. So fewer than a third folks coming out for the municipal election.
Yeah. And sorry,
I'm going to highlight too one of the really bright spots in our report, and because you mentioned youth and students, right? I mean, we know that yes, youth are less likely to participate. So among our survey of these leaders, we in a kind of a bit of an experiment, sort of have fun with this. This hadn't been done in the diversity leads reports. We thought, let's look at the youth sector. Well, what is the youth sector, and where do we find these leaders? So we looked at inclusiveness and diversity among student councils. University, college, and high school. And the bright spot is we find that they're hugely inclusive. So we have youth in this community, a youth leadership sector that's very inclusive. It's half women, half men, and it's about 57% visible minority. So that's terrific.
A hopeful sign. Yeah.
And we have to figure out as a community how to ensure that we keep that momentum going among our youth, and that we when we're looking for future leaders, we look into that, what is really a deep pool of young, experienced leaders in our community, because it's an inclusive group.
It sure is.
So something interesting is happening there.
So we're actually going to run out of time, and I want to provide each of you with an opportunity to just reflect upon what individuals can do in response to the Vital Signs report and the Accelerator report to hopefully A, feel a sense of connectedness to what's going on here, but B, perhaps to make a small contribution on continuing the positive momentum that we've seen in various areas. So in a minute and a half or so, because we got about 3 minutes left, Jeff Wingard, what would you recommend?
So if you haven't taken a look at this report, I'd just take a quick scan over some of the issue areas, because it is a really broad report. And I think there will be areas that tweak your interest and captivate you and make you say, what could I do about the art sector, which is growing leaps and bounds right now? And maybe that's an area where you want to get involved. So the first thing is, pick a couple of areas that you think might be interesting to you and where there is progress happening and you think you can make a difference. And then I think reach out to friends, neighbors, community members, organizations that are doing work in this area and offer your support and assistance. There is a lot of good work happening in Hamilton, and getting attached to that and offering additional resources for that will make a lot of difference.
Same question to you, Karen Bird.
Also, I think read the report, look at these 9 sectors. Everybody who works in some capacity, and particularly leaders in our community, will find themselves in one of those sectors, and they can see what's going on. So the numbers are clear. My recommendation, our recommendation in the report, is to think about a formal model of mentorship. And I would even say perhaps not mentorship so much as sponsorship. Yeah. What we know from broader research is that when mentorship is informal, when leaders who are in their organizations and they want to do good, they want to find young people and help them who show promise and help them to advance through their industry, we tend to look to people who look like younger versions of ourselves.
For sure.
Remind us of ourselves. We can see, we were in their shoes once, and we have a natural proclivity to reach out to them. And it's we just need to correct that a little bit and remind ourselves that people who may not look like us may be just as talented, just as enthusiastic, and to look for the talent there. And to quite consciously develop a mentorship sponsorship model that it has an inclusivity lens, that we recognize that we have a problem of a lack of inclusion in leadership in our community, and that we have a mechanism to do something about it.
And on that note, we are out of time, but I am going to say that this October we've got a municipal election, and that's not a bad place to start. And from personal experience, as a guy that ran at a very young age for political office, I was inspired by a mentor named Father Sean O'Sullivan, who got elected to the House of Commons at 20 years of age, and showed me in a very tangible way that it was possible and that young people could participate and make a contribution. On that note, we're a wrap. Jeff Wingard, Dr. Karen Bird, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your continuing work in this community, and particularly in advancing the interests of everybody being part of our future. I'm Terry Cooke. You've been watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. We'll see you again in the fall. Hope you'll join us again then. Have a great summer.